Hello, and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. Today on the podcast, I'm talking to GP Dr Lucy Henshall and healthcare consultant and former practice manager Penny Flack about their initiative Welcome Back to Work, which helps support GPs back into the workplace if they've had less than 2 years away. Lucy and Penny primarily work in Suffolk, but they also work with GPs in other parts of the country as well. In this conversation, they explain how Welcome Back to Work helps GPs, the importance of tailoring support to individual doctors, and why we need a much more flexible approach to GP retention than's currently available. They also talk about what GP practices can do to support GPs returning to work and those who may need more flexibility in the way that they work and the benefits of doing this, as well as how they hope their approach could be scaled up to work across local healthcare systems or even nationally to help ensure experienced GPs are not lost to the NHS. This is a really fascinating conversation about such an important topic, so I hope that you enjoy it. There is a link to Lucy and Penny's website in the notes for this episode. I'm really pleased to welcome onto the podcast Dr Lucy Henshall and Penny Flack. Lucy is a GP and Penny is a former practice manager who's gone on to run a healthcare consultancy business. Lucy and Penny set up Welcome Back to Work that has developed a programme that helps clinicians who've been out of the workplace for less than 2 years to return to work. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's really kind of you to invite us, Emma.
Yeah, great to be here, Emma. Thank you.
First of all, I thought it'd be quite a good idea for you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and your background. So maybe, Lucy, if we start with you, what's your background and how did you come into this work?
I got into this line of work the roots of it were really grounded in a very personal experience. I'd been a partner in a practice for 20 years. I've been a GP since I finished my BTS in 1991. But I found myself in a no man's land that I nicknamed the Gap, having left a partnership via a whole string of colliding unexpected circumstances, including circumstances impacting my GP husband, and found myself in this extraordinary position of being in the environment, in the geographic locality of where I had worked for 20 years and being invisible. And it was really disempowering. More or less on a personal mission, I went off and found senior leads, national medical directors of NHS England, workforce leads in NHS England, 2016, 17, and said, hang on a minute, there's a gap here. You've got schemes and programmes for 2 years onwards. And there's nada in this 0 to 2 year gap. And we're losing people, we're bleeding people. And hey, I can tell you a story. Me and half a dozen others I knew at the time to whom it was happening. That's where the roots are from, but it's grown very much from that.
As you say, Emma, my background started out in general practice, where I was a practice manager, and then I moved on to work across various NHS independent healthcare organisations and set up on my own working independently about 10 years ago. And in the last, I should think, 5-6 years, my work has centred mostly around workforce initiatives, and I've become very interested in workforce matters. Lucy and I were introduced by a mutual colleague who knew that we were both working on things related to GP workforce and suggested that we meet over a cup of coffee, where it was all started and stemmed from.
Tell us a little bit about Welcome Back to Work. Lucy, what made you decide that that was what you were going to focus on, and what are you trying to do with it all?
We had similar views on people being a really key part of workforce. So starting with people, not numbers, starting at the organic, individual, human level was definitely the way both of us operate. When we came together in that conversation, we didn't have a clear plan of we're going to make a thing. And in fact, even at this point, Welcome Back to Work isn't actually a company. It's a way of being rather than a thing, something that is core to how we work. So at the point that she and I came together, I was already informally supporting a couple of peers who were struggling to get back to work. And we could both see that there were the possibility of doing things in a different way, that it's not about creating a scheme, an offer, a programme, anything rigid. It's more about meeting people where they are and working out what's happening and what can we do to help. And so there was a natural synergy. And that first conversation that we had over coffee is literally how we start our work with individuals is, well, let's get together and find out what's going on and be curious. It's still the same. It's got the same core philosophy behind it as it had in 2016, 17, 18, in that formative phase of it's not about creating a thing. It's about listening to the individuals and establishing what their needs are and working with them to help them get to where they're trying to get to. And that fundamental difference in our way of being from all of the schemes and all of the programs and all of the projects and pilots, and these words literally make my skin prickle, that fundamental difference is why what we do works so well, and is also why conveying it into the system and trying to get people to be curious and listen to the how is incredibly difficult.
And over the period of time that Lucy and I have been working over the last 5 years, the core bit, as Lucy said, has remained the same, our natural curiosity around the individual and putting the person first. What we understand much, much more about now is that we can be clear that we can see the impact of our work. Our vision, we state, is that we see a world in which every GP feels fully supported to flourish. So that's really core and huge part of what we do, is supporting individuals to flourish, be the very best that they can. But we also want to be able to have really bold conversations, transformational conversations across systems. And that's the work that we're trying to get into now, is knocking on doors and encouraging people to be curious and come and have a conversation with us to find out how they can maximise the benefit of what we've experienced and what we know, and play that back into workforce strategies to make a real difference at system level. We know we have impact with the practices who employ GPs who are returning to work. Now we'd like to explore that piece of work around how do we have impact at system level.
So you're actually very much focused on GPs who've been out of the workplace for less than 2 years. Why have you chosen to focus on that group in particular?
I think it was March 2017, 1 year into the 5-year forward view. Wonderful wall chart shared by Arvind Madan of all of the retention initiatives. And all I could see in his slide was this glaring hole of the nothing for people who have not been away long enough to be eligible to be supported back into work. So that's always been my focus. It was not about finding a job in GP retention. It was about finding a solution to the blind spot. This blind spot is still also not fully understood because there's a perception that you just go back to work. So that's why this area. We work in the in-between spaces. We've used that phrase quite a lot with our conversations into the system, is we are almost like the glue that underpins and weaves its way between the other rigid offers that exist. I know they are marketed as flexible, but in my vocabulary, they're quite rigid. The return to practice scheme is about measuring the learning shortfall, passing a test or a conversation, having a prescribed return to work package, and then a sign-off. It might surprise you to know that some of the cohort of GPs we work with have been through that scheme, and we've had people come through the international GP scheme, and yet they're still lost in plain sight. After all of that investment, it hasn't actually reintegrated them. We're just meeting the needs of the individuals. It's not rocket science. It's incredibly simple. It's if you understand what the barriers for the individuals are, then you can begin to overcome them jointly, co-creating solutions with those individuals and with people inside the system.
So Penny, maybe you could start with this one. When you work with an individual, how does it work? So someone comes to you, needs a bit of help to work out what to do. What do you actually do?
So the first thing we do is that we arrange a time to have a conversation, to start that conversation with the individual, and to spend time listening to the set of circumstances that surround them, the whole person, what's going on. GPs are human beings, and we all know that around us as individuals there is lots of other things, all of which will impact and play into our work and the way in which we're able to work. So very much about conversation, deep listening, exploring people's ambitions, where they want to get to, by when. We start to understand the barriers that they might need to overcome. They can be very practical things, from how do I access mandatory training? And we gently explore with individuals the steps they need to take in order to get to the point that they want to get to. We do that with a huge amount of compassion and understanding that things change. And what you think is the first step today may be entirely different tomorrow, or maybe entirely different when you've stepped back into a general practice setting because things go on around you. We walk alongside people, and our GPs have said to us, I feel you there beside me. We will walk into conversations very deliberately with people if that is helpful. So enter into a conversation with a practice or with a training hub or whoever it might be in the system to support and facilitate a conversation if that's required. So I guess the word that comes to mind is Welcome Back to Work GPs. We empower them to take the steps themselves. And I think the really important other thing about this is when a Welcome Back to Work GP returns to work, we don't sign them off. They're part of Welcome Back to Work until they say, hey, I don't want to be part of this anymore. Because again, what we know is, and we see this from our Welcome Back to Work alumni, is life happens. And so there may be circumstances which mean that they'd like to come back and access support and help and guidance again.
I was going to come on to the alumni, but you've mentioned it now, so you may as well talk about that now. That sounds like it must be very useful for people, to be connected with other people who are in a very similar position to them. So how does that work?
Essentially, it's a virtual community, although there is an element of face-to-face as well. So we try and intersperse a virtual environment with creating opportunities for people to get together in person. It is something that's very consistent and it creates an opportunity for people to connect and have conversation where people are able to mutually support one another in a space where there is no fixed agenda. So a conversation is determined by the individuals who come into that space together at a particular time.
That's a lovely description. And the consistency Penny alludes to is there is a forum weekly that meets. But I think even before people join that forum, the sense of belonging, that being connected into a community of people who have experienced not the same, because we do genuinely believe everybody's unique, but have experienced stuff that has parallels and similarities. The isolation, professional disconnect, I think in metaphor. If you can imagine general practice as an ocean-going liner steaming across the Atlantic, people who come to us have, for whatever reason, left the ship. Something's happened and they've fallen into the sea. And the first thing we do is sling them a life ring and a rope. So they're no longer drifting further away. But then we connect them with other people who are actually trying to get back on that ship. I mean, the aha moments, it's very moving to see and hear people saying, I thought I was imagining the barriers. So we have people every stage of the journey and every career stage as well. So there's this sort of, I see you over there back at work, and you've just told me privately what a mess things were last year. That inspires me. That's confidence building. I think it's not understood how shattering it is to professional self-confidence to be disconnected. We see wonderful doctors. All of the doctors who've come to, all of the GPs who've come to us, I would employ if I was still a senior partner in a practice as I was. They're fabulous doctors. These are not the dodgy edges of our profession. These are the you and me, and I'm speaking to my peers out here and who are listening to this podcast. The things that have happened to doctors could happen to any one of you tomorrow or next week. And it can really crack self-confidence. So putting them together enables them to boost each other's self-confidence.
So Lucy, it sounds like from what you're saying there that the people you help are very, very varied and the reasons they have for being out of work are varied. But are there any common traits? I mean, are there any common things that you unearth when you're talking to people, whether or not it's to do with the general pressures and stress, a lot of it, or whether there's other reasons that people are leaving the workplace?
To clarify, very few, one or two, the retirees who came back would agree they'd left the workforce. None of the others believe they'd left the workforce, but they were not in work for a collection of reasons. They didn't choose to leave and then choose to come back. Circumstances unfolded. And that's the common thread is, for most people, there have been a collision of circumstances. And perhaps that's why they end up coming to us. It wasn't one thing, it was that and that. So it was an illness and a relocation, a family crisis, and coinciding with the end of a contract in a job. So they're then in no man's land with no job. Are there common themes? Undoubtedly, yes. Just like doctors get illnesses, doctors also have disabilities. They also acquire disabilities through accidents and misfortune. But it's the compounding impact of different things, sometimes unpredictable. Maybe even during their planned return to work, another thing happens. And real life tends not to have quick and tidy solutions. How you leave somewhere will always influence how you might go back to somewhere not dissimilar. So that can make the personal challenge, it's back to this sort of personal self-confidence aspect of it, the leap of faith involved into going back into the environment of general practice which has not got easier in the 4, 6, 8 years we've been doing this work. It's got harder. And if you've got all these other compounding circumstances as well, it's challenging. I think coming back to the NHS England scheme, the return to practice scheme offers a bit of flexibility on less than full time, and that's about it. But you can't start with that. You can't say, look, I want to do a bit now and then I need to take a breather because my child with complex needs an operation and I'm going to have to take another 3 months off to look after them, but then I'll pick up again later. That's how real life works. Schemes and programmes tend not to.
What do you think, Penny?
One of the things that in particular we saw during COVID was the rapid emergence of technical solutions in general practice. So all of a sudden, virtual consultations became a thing, remote consultations, remote ways of working. And for somebody who was looking to return, who wasn't in the moment in that practice, they were completely, there was another layer of isolation in there, because the expectation walking back into a job was that you knew how to do it and that you had that skill.
So it's very easy for people in good faith to say, oh, well, if you just start back 2 sessions a week, you'll get the hang of it. It doesn't work like that. It's too easy to say, yeah, but you can learn that in the job. You can't find a job because you don't know what job to look for if you don't know what it's all about because you haven't been there. So that's one of the things we facilitate is not exposure in a threatening way, but opportunity to be inside the general practice environment in compassionate, intelligent, curious practices where people say, well, come and hang out for a while and see what we're doing, see what it looks like.
So is that how you do that? You get practices that you know to kind of let people come in and spend a bit of time and get a bit more familiar with the environment again?
It breaks down some of the barriers of uncertainty. It's also incredibly difficult to curate in the current climate. There aren't many practices with time and physical space surplus. So it's a big ask of practices. But yes, you're right. We have a short list of practices that we use the phrase that get it. They understand what the ask is. But even they sometimes have to say, I can't help just now because of circumstances, workload pressures.
And I think that is really a great illustration as well of the bold conversations we'd like to have across systems. So let's get into a bold conversation across the system to say, how do we engineer this opportunity for GPs to step back in other environments that we've got access to across our system? Again, the natural assumption is they've got to come back into a GP practice. But actually, how about if we think about stepping gently back into a GP-run community service or into a hospital environment where that individual GP may have a clinical interest?
Penny's absolutely right. There's 1,000 different ways you could get from A to B. At the moment, the system is very focused on being a GP looks like this, and everybody has to do the same. If you stand back from the framework of the NHS and the rules and regulations of appraisal and revalidation and bring it back to a fundamental human level, what would make it easier to go back to work? It would be to pick off the chunks that are the low-hanging fruit. What do I enjoy doing? I enjoy doing dermatology. I'll go and sit in with a consultant and get that bit of my brain going again. Get the buzz back, get the passion back, interact with patients, maybe without the expectation of work output. And then I'll build this on it, and then I'll build that on it. And that makes that journey a progressive success. And success breeds success, and back to the growing confidence. We have unfortunately got, as the backdrop to all of this, an appraisal and revalidation system that thinks being a GP is a particular shape. And we encounter very frequently concerns from the individual about timelines, upcoming appraisals, or pre-revalidation, last appraisal in the cycle, where the rules by which they are judged, and I'm afraid I will use the word judged, they are judged by a rule set that says being a GP has to look like this. It's not helpful for those individuals. I'll be honest, it blows my mind that this is the reality, is people can be coming back to work with the potential to offer anything up to 30 or 40 years of work inside the NHS. We need to be able to have these bold conversations inside the system going, oh, hang on a minute, this is a doctor in whom hundreds of thousands of pounds have been invested. They're an existing UK-trained, fully qualified, experienced doctor for whom a load of stuff happened over the last year, but they're on their way back. Can we please see their value and worth and potential rather than measuring the shortfall? Turn it on its head. What can you bring to the table? Let's allow that to happen. We're living in a world with a shortage of GPs. Why on earth would the system not want to do everything within its gift and power to nurture and support the people we've actually got?
We have this lovely other analogy of the roundabout, and you'd be on the roundabout, and the best thing you could do was to spin it and spin it and spin it with your friends. Somebody might fall off, and then you'd keep spinning it and spinning it and spinning it as they tried to get back on, and they'd hold out a hand and try and grab it. Nobody would slow it down enough for them to get back on. And we talk about that analogy in the alumni sometimes with GPs, because that's what it feels like. The roundabout is spinning faster and faster. People are on it. They're getting dizzier and dizzier. Some people fall off. They want to get back on, but nobody will slow it down enough for them to step back on safely onto that roundabout so they can start going round again.
We've talked a little bit about individuals, but between individuals and the system, which we've also mentioned, there's the practices themselves. So what can practices do to help support GPs who are returning to work after some time out, Penny?
It's a lovely point to focus on and very relevant. In the last few months, we've been working with practices in this conversation. Generally for a practice, if you've got a person who's away from work, they're thinking about returning, don't be afraid of the conversation. Open the conversation up with compassion, ask the question and explore with the individual, what does a good return to work look like for you? Don't be afraid of the conversation for a returner. And don't be afraid of keeping in touch with people if they're not at work. And I know there's HR elements that surround that, and you must do this and you mustn't do that. The other part of it is when you're looking to offer your practice and your practice team out to a GP who's returning, so they haven't worked for you before. It's again, we sort of talk about it with our practices who do this really, really well. It's wrapping their arms around an individual gently, recognising that one step forward may mean that somebody takes 2 or 3 steps back before they take 6 steps forward again, and being kind and compassionate without making assumptions about the individual themselves.
The point is that there's value in practices doing that, isn't there? Taking that time, because what they get at the end of it is a really experienced doctor who has a lot to offer.
Yes, and perhaps we can illustrate the impact that a practice that adopts that way of working and that way of being across their practice team. So we have a practice that will have had within its practice team 5, 6 plus welcome back to work GPs, it may even be more, who add huge value to their practice team, and the practice is able to work flexibly to embrace the whole and create that environment where that GP can come in and be their very best. From a recruitment point of view, it's a no-brainer.
How do you see it scaling up to a system, and then would you like to see it become something that could be rolled out nationwide?
In terms of where we work, our Welcome Back to Work website is out there, and indeed we've been contacted by GPs who are currently abroad and looking to come back into the UK. We will have a conversation with anybody who finds us. That just seems to us the right thing to do. We are specifically commissioned up until the end of this financial year by our local integrated care system to focus on welcome back to work across our immediate geography.
Penny and I clearly can't support every GP in the country, but the why we do it the way we do it is the bit that we'd like to have a conversation about at national level, and that is absolutely transferable. And we have found some allies in other areas, and we have found people who get it. But the nature of NHS structures brings things back down into localities, which is to do with money flows, budgets, accountability, lines of responsibility, all of which get in the way of the individuals who just want to go back to work and do their thing. It's very frustrating to be demonstrating year after year with successful return to work GPs, value for money, it's such a no-brainer compared to other expensive schemes. And yet getting access to those conversations really hard.
There's obviously question marks over NHS England's commitment to some of this because they've scrapped some retention schemes and apparently there's going to be replacements. We don't know what they are yet, no signs of them. Lucy, what do you think a national retention scheme for GPs should look like?
It's something I've been giving a lot of thought to, and there's part of me that thinks that the pot of money definitely should be a national phenomenon and the entrance point should be simple, visible, accessible, not an anonymous website, not a send your request to info@.com, but a gateway that is truly facilitative, that starts with perhaps a conversation like Penny and I have. And then what happens next, in a perfect world, would be the money to support the kind of things we do and other things that we haven't thought of that fix the problems for that individual. Almost down to a personal health budget sort of philosophy, but not quite. So retaining the flexibility of meeting the needs of the individual.
And so that's what you're talking about when you're talking about you're having conversations with your system about how you can scale it up to work across the system, looking at the whole issue of GP retention more holistically with more opportunities, more flexibility for how GPs can return to work. Is that what you're trying to do, Penny, in your area?
Absolutely. And looking to where there are the national schemes. So Return to Practice was recently relaunched with some changes to it. It's a national scheme. How do you embrace that locally and take maximum benefit from those individual GPs who are going through that scheme, who are in your patch? Who are they? Do you know who they are? Do you know how many of them are there? How do you then embrace those individuals and support them, as Lucy has said, simple, visible, accessible? So how do you use the framework of the Return to Practice scheme with some core principles and bring those individuals into your local workforce where you value and you nurture them and you seek to retain them in your local workforce?
I think the thing that we see, particularly over the last year with the younger GPs that have come our way, is not just the potential for a doctor being back at work, but the decades that they will then contribute if you get this bit right, set against the risk that if you don't do the right thing by them, they're not being greedy or needy. They just need re-enablement. If you don't do that, where are you going to get 30 years of an experienced professional from instead? The investment of money, it should be measurable not in how many GPs came back to work, but actually that's somebody back in the system for potentially 30 years. Why would you not invest in that? So, I'm very anxious, very concerned by the radio silence that we have at the moment around these new ideas from NHS England to replace the ones they've taken away. Because the New to Practice Fellowship was getting nicely embedded. We've got some good examples on our doorstep of it working beautifully. In monetary terms, getting this element of bespoke re-enablement right is not expensive. It's misunderstood as, that's all a bit nice, that's all a bit cosy. No, it isn't. It's just doing the right thing by human beings to enable them to thrive and flourish again. And if the philosophy can be adopted, I think the costs would fall. A lot of the time and effort we put in and a lot of the expense that goes on unseen is battling things that didn't need to be there anyway, getting round these hurdles and barriers instead of just going, well, why don't we just take the barrier away and smooth the path?
It would probably be better if people didn't need to leave work in the first place. Penny, is there anything that the NHS could do to make sure that GPs, stay in the workplace?
I think there's an element in that, Emma, that is that we have to be realistic that it is entirely normal for people to leave work. GPs are no different, as are any other members of the practice team. The bit that is missing, that was there years ago, is that individual stays connected into the health economy and somebody knows that they've left, but somebody is still in conversation with them and that they're connected in to that system. The example that just popped into my head is that if you don't use your NHS Net email for 3 months, it gets switched off. NHS Net email is your route into connection and your route into accessing the things that enable you to go back to work. Everybody has the right to leave work and to disappear if they wish to. For some individuals, they leave work for a set of circumstances and wish to remain visible. And there is no system in place now that facilitates that to happen. In years gone by, when the performers list was a local thing, was managed locally, you were much more visible. Now it's national. An individual GP is lost into that massive void. How easy would it be to bring that back again locally and allow local systems to know who their workforce is?
We've asked over the years, in different areas, how many GPs have you got who are on maternity leave at the moment? Don't know. How many GPs have you got on the NHS GP retention scheme? No, we don't count that. How many GPs have you got who are in locum land, and do you actually know who they are, and are they interconnected? And the work Penny was doing when we first came together was to do with supporting locums who, have some, it's the loneliest space to work in general practice. It's much maligned. It's actually a very difficult type of work because you're parachuting in and out of different places. But the professional support needs are there. And connecting locums together and connecting locums into a system in a more respectful way is what enables them to maybe locum for a while because of, but as we say, personal, family circumstances, health issues. For a time, locum work is what works, but actually my aspiration is to be a partner later on. Actually, they may be doing that because that's literally what they need to do. They can't hold down a job that involves turning up 3 times a week because their child's severe epilepsy means that 1 or 2 times a week they won't be able to go there, so they need to work differently. I think normalising the fact that life is full of life stages and things will happen to people and those things will change those people, which will mean their career needs to evolve to accommodate. But their medical skills and knowledge are still there. Just because they've got a different job description or a different contractual arrangement doesn't make them less worth.
So, Lucy, you were talking there about some examples, but some of this is about EDI, isn't it? So equality, diversity and inclusion. How does that play into the work that you're doing around people returning to work?
So just to set the scene as a backdrop, 20% of the population have a disability. It's a no-brainer. That's the same within the GP population. And maybe they're not a visible disability. So keeping an open mind to the fact that there might be things you don't know about your peers and colleagues, and maybe you don't even need to know all of the details, but it's being open and curious about, when we first meet a GP, we will ask, how can we help? I think as a culture piece within general practice, that can be translated into, how can we help you to be most effective in work? What do you need us to do for you? Do you have ideas about how you could work and thrive more or be more productive? Allows people to say, actually a standing desk would just be fantastic. Quick fix. It's just moving minds away from it has to look like the way it's always looked is relevant. In terms of themes of the GPs who come to us, it's an uncomfortable truth that there's a hesitancy, an unwillingness to accommodate doing things differently, and that's okay. So for this individual, their work needs to look different to the other person down the corridor, and that's okay. It's not that they're getting an easier job. It might actually be more difficult for them, but you're giving them fair opportunity. You need to think differently, and you need to think about the individuals and ask them in an unthreatening way, what would help you back into the workplace so that you could be a great part of our team. It's not a battle. It should never be a battle. Getting it right is about communication. It's about deep listening, creative solutions, rather than trying to make everybody be the same. And if you have a difference, be it race, colour, creed, disability or otherwise, you've got to somehow as an individual do something to fix that so you can fit into this same box.
There's an element of that links back into your earlier question, Emma, about practices and practices' way of thinking and way of being. I've been in conversation with practice managers where they've expressed almost a reluctance and a fear that if they have this conversation with a GP, it's going to open up the floodgates to everybody asking for the same. And my reply to that is, so what's wrong with that? So helping individuals, creating the environment where people are able to be their very best version of themselves is exactly the place we need to get to in general practice and across the NHS.
That's a really nice place to leave it, I think. Thank you both of you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been honestly a really brilliant conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been fabulous to talk to you and share with you what we do.
Huge pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Penny and Lucy for taking the time to talk with me. I'll be back next week for our regular review of the key news stories affecting general practice, so please do join me then. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with all the latest news, including the results of the BMA's referendum on the GP contract in England, on our website at GPonline.com.